Everything in the Bible changes in a single 40-day period. This video breaks down the 40 days after the resurrection, starting with the disciples' confusion, then walking through the moments Jesus appeared to them, explained what really happened, and connected everything they had missed. It follows how their understanding changed step by step, leading to the moment they went from uncertain followers to fully convinced witnesses ready to carry the message forward. Because those 40 days reveal what most people overlook, how that transformation actually happened, and why it's the reason the message didn't fade, but continues to shape how people think about hope, forgiveness, and purpose today. This wasn't as unexpected as it seemed. At first, the resurrection can feel like a sudden, unexpected moment. But when you take a step back, it really isn't. Long before it happened, there were already clear hints pointing in this direction. The prophet Isaiah described someone who would suffer deeply and yet continue on afterward. And David wrote about God not allowing his chosen one to remain in the grave. So when Jesus rises, it isn't introducing a completely new idea. It's bringing a long story to a turning point that had been building for a long time. And that connects to today in a simple but important way. It presents the resurrection not just as something to believe, but as part of a larger claim. That what God promises doesn't stay theoretical. It shows up in real moments, in real history. But even with that, something still doesn't add up right away. If everything was building toward this moment, why didn't the people closest to Jesus immediately understand it? That question is exactly what the next 40 days answer. They weren't doubting for no reason. It's easy to assume the disciples should have immediately believed, but when you look closely, their reaction is actually very human. They didn't just hear about Jesus dying, they watched it happen. They saw the arrest, the trial, and the crucifixion. They saw him suffer and they saw him die. So when the resurrection is suddenly being reported, it's not just surprising, it feels impossible. They hear that the tomb is empty. They're told Jesus is alive. And instead of instant confidence, there's hesitation. Some aren't sure what to think. Some don't recognize him at first. Others wonder if what they're seeing is even real. And that doesn't weaken the story, it actually grounds it. Because it shows that belief didn't begin with certainty. It began with people trying to process something that completely went against what they had just witnessed. They had been expecting a king like David, someone who would step into power and change things in a visible, immediate way. But instead, they saw him crucified. So now they're trying to make sense of two things that don't seem to fit together. What they saw with their own eyes, and what they're now being told is true. That kind of tension is something people still experience today. Moments where reality doesn't line up with expectations, and you're left trying to figure out what it all means. This is where the 40 days begin to matter more, because Jesus doesn't just appear and disappear. He takes time to walk them through it. He meets two followers on the road and explains how everything connects, not by adding something new, but by helping them see what was already there. And that's the shift. The events don't change, their understanding does. This is where everything starts to come together. During these 40 days, something deeper than proof is happening. Yes, Jesus makes it clear that he's alive. He shows them his wounds, talks with them, and even eats with them. But the bigger change is how they begin to understand what it all means. He starts connecting the story for them, how the suffering, the cross, and the resurrection were all part of the same plan. That answers the question they couldn't get past. Why did it happen this way? Because it wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. And that idea still shapes how people think today. If the cross was intentional, then forgiveness isn't uncertain or out of reach. It's something that's been made possible. At the same time, their role begins to shift. They're no longer just following. They're being prepared to carry this message forward, and not just where they are, but beyond it. Still, there's one part that feels unexpected. Even after all of this, they're told to wait, which raises a natural question. If they understand what happened and know what they're supposed to do, why not start right away? That answer connects to what comes next. The shift is deeper than it looks. Up to this point, everything had been centered around structure, laws, rituals, and systems, all of it pointing forward. Now, during these 40 days, that forward becomes clear. The focus begins to shift, not away from what came before, but deeper than it. From external actions to internal change, from going through motions to being transformed. And that connects directly to something people still wrestle with: the difference between doing the right things on the outside and actually experiencing real change on the inside. This is when the disciples really change. At the beginning of these 40 days, the disciples are unsure. They're processing everything. They're holding back. By the end, that's no longer the case. They're clear. They're confident. They're ready. They're not just followers anymore. They're witnesses. And that shift explains what happens next. Because when someone moves from uncertainty to conviction, it changes how they act. That was true then, and it's still true now. What looks like the end is actually a transition. Then comes a moment that could feel like the conclusion. Jesus leaves. But it's not really the end, it's a transition. The focus shifts from what Jesus was doing physically to what would now happen through his followers. And that pattern still shows up today. Something begins in one place and then continues through others. Why this still connects today. When you look back at these 40 days, they explain a lot. They explain how the disciples changed so quickly, why the message didn't fade out, how everything moved forward. But they also point to something more personal. Because if the resurrection is true, it doesn't just change how people view the past. It reshapes how people think about hope, about forgiveness, about whether their life has a purpose beyond what they can see right now. Those are the same questions people are still asking. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, everything in the Bible really does shift in those 40 days. Not because a completely new story begins, but because the entire story finally comes into focus. Those 40 days connect everything. What was promised, what actually happened, and what came next. The resurrection shows that something happened. Those 40 days explain what it meant. And if it's true, it doesn't just explain the past, it changes how everything is seen now.